Every killer leaves a trace. But this time whoever played this game had planned it too well. No witnesses, no sounds, just a body screaming in silence. And the most terrifying part? The murderer was still here, close enough that you could almost feel their breath. Little Hemsby stirred awake that autumn morning beneath a sky reluctantly shedding its grey cloak, the first pale fingers of dawn stretching over rooftops slick with last night's rain. The air carried the sharp bite of impending frost, crisp enough to make breath fog in the stillness, the kind of morning that set boots tapping briskly on cobbled lanes and made the village look like an oil painting left unfinished, beautiful, yet missing something. The scent of damp earth and burning coal tangled in the air as chimneys puffed out their thin plumes, dissolving into the early light like whispered secrets. Children, wrapped in scarves far too big for them, chased one another down the lane, their laughter ringing high and fleeting. A dog barked at nothing, its sound swallowed by the hush of something unseen settling over the town. Old Mr. Prentice at the corner shop wiped his windows with a furrowed brow, as if polishing the glass might reveal something hidden beyond it. But something was already shifting beneath the village's quiet charm, a current of unease creeping beneath doorways and slipping into hushed conversations before anyone had the sense to name it. By the time Mrs. Hartwell pushed through the door of the tea shop, the brass bell above it clanging in protest, the undercurrent had swelled into something thick, something tangible. Her cheeks were flushed raw from the cold, but her expression was grimmer still, lips pursed tight enough to snap a thread. She hesitated just inside, eyes scanning the empty room save for Miss Jenkins, who at 72 had learned that silence was the best way to hear everything. Slowly, Mrs. Hartwell leaned over the counter, the scent of lavender and boiled cabbage clinging to her, and breathed out a single word that cut through the quiet like a knife through cloth. Murder. Miss Jenkins sucked in a sharp breath, her teacup trembling in her fingers. Who? She whispered, though she already knew the answer would be heavy. Lady Elena, Mrs. Hartwell murmured, as though saying it aloud might summon something worse. And just like that, the whisper turned to wildfire. By noon, it had slipped beneath doors, threaded through hedges, and climbed over fences, infecting every idle conversation and lingering pause. The postman, normally efficient in his rounds, lingered a little too long at each doorstep, fishing for details. The butcher exchanged dark mutterings with the baker, their words curling like smoke, thick with unspoken accusations. Near the village green, the smith paused mid-swing, the clang of his hammer forgotten as the weight of the news settled across Little Hemsby like a gathering storm. And at the heart of it all stood Hemsby Manor, perched at the edge of town like an old sentinel, its ivy-clad walls staring down as though in silent judgment. Inside, the details grew darker. The sitting room, once a place of quiet elegance, had turned into a crime scene, its grandeur now unsettling in its stillness. A porcelain teacup lay shattered, its spilled contents staining the Persian rug like ink blotted across a letter filled with unsaid words. The fireplace sat cold, its embers long since snuffed out, leaving the air thick with the ghost of burned wood. A letter, half open, rested on the side table, its edges curled as if clutched in a trembling hand, the parchment smeared with something too dark to be ink. And there, catching the slanting afternoon light, a single lock of chestnut hair gleamed unnervingly against the rich fabric of the carpet, a detail too deliberate. A message, perhaps. The police, clad in their dark coats and quick tempers, prodded and questioned, their presence unsettling in a village unused to the weight of real crime. But the villagers, they had their own theories, their own whispers in the bakery, the market, the churchyard. "I'd wager it's that foreigner," someone murmured near the grocer's. "Always hanging about Lady Elena, wasn't he? Too friendly, if you ask me," came another voice. "There's been talk, you know." And in the village square, under the skeletal reach of the great beech tree, Sir Reginald stood stiff against the rising murmurs, his coat collar turned up, but it did little to shield him from the creeping weight of accusation. His face, once handsome in a sharp, effortless way, was drawn tight with something unreadable: grief, anger, fear. Across from him, Dr. Whitaker, his old friend and partner in too many gin-soaked chess matches, watched him with eyes that missed nothing. "You need to keep your head," Whitaker murmured. Reginald exhaled sharply, running a hand through his graying hair. "I didn't kill her," he snapped, then swallowed hard. "God help me, Whit, I didn't." "I believe you," Whitaker said, measured, steady. "Doesn't mean they will." Reginald's gaze drifted toward the manor, toward the darkened windows where shadows stretched long against the setting sun. His expression shifted, something flitting across his features, something unspoken. "She was complicated," he said, finally. "You know how people talk. We were close, yes, but this—" He shook his head, his voice thinner now. "This wasn't supposed to happen." Whitaker didn't answer immediately. His gaze flicked toward the gathering villagers, their voices buzzing like wasps, their suspicions quick to settle on the most convenient target. He sighed. "Truth is, Reg, doesn't matter what was supposed to happen, only what people believe did." Across the street, tucked behind a window fogged by the warmth inside, Miss Marple in silence, a quiet observer. She sipped her tea, her face lined with the weight of years, yet her eyes missed nothing. People, she always said, were like stitches in a great tapestry. Watch closely enough, and the pattern would emerge. And this morning, as she stirred her tea, she saw the first thread loosen, the first unraveling of something far deeper than idle gossip. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, creeping shadows over the village, life pressed on. Children were herded home, the baker's boy pulled down the shop shutters, and yet the air remained thick, charged with the kind of tension that clung, that whispered, that waited. Somewhere, hidden in the folds of speculation and fear, the truth lingered, watching, waiting. And Miss Marple, with her careful hands and patient eyes, was already beginning to thread the first stitch toward it. The morning unfurled in Little Hemsby with a quiet so taut it felt like a held breath. Mist clung low over the cobbled streets, curling through the air in slow, lingering wisps, as though reluctant to reveal the secrets it veiled. The corner shop's windows, freshly wiped by old Mr. Prentice, gleamed like watchful eyes surveying the village, as if Little Hemsby were under some unspoken scrutiny. Not officially, not yet. Down at the tea shop, the brass bell jangled, its sharp chime cutting through the hush, as Mrs. Hartwell bustled in, her cheeks raw from the cold, her lips drawn tight with the weight of something unsaid. The scent of lavender and boiled cabbage clung to her as she leaned across the counter, her voice barely above a breath. "Terrible business," she whispered, though only Miss Jenkins, perched in her usual spot, was there to hear. 72 years had sharpened Miss Jenkins' senses rather than dulled them. Her ears, keener than a fox's, had a way of catching whispers even before they were spoken. Her hands, wrapped around a fine porcelain teacup, trembled as Mrs. Hartwell's next words spilled into the room like ink seeping into paper. Lady Elena, found dead in her own sitting room. The spoon slipped from Miss Jenkins' fingers, clattering against china as she gasped. "Dead," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hartwell cast a glance around, despite the empty room, before leaning in further. "Murder," she murmured, and the words slashed through the village like a cold wind through an open door. By noon, it had taken on a life of its own, whispered between hedges, exchanged in hurried conversations over fences. The postman, usually efficient in his rounds, lingered too long at each doorstep, fishing for new scraps of information. The blacksmith set his tools down mid-swing, muttering about money, about betrayal, about how those with power often found themselves at the wrong end of a sharp fate. At the very heart of it all loomed Hemsby Manor, its ancient stone facade watching the village with silent disapproval, its ivy-clad walls swallowing secrets as easily as the shadows swallowed light. It was there, beyond its grand entrance, that the scene lay frozen in the cold grasp of death. A porcelain teacup, shattered across the rug, its spilled contents dark and spreading, soaking into the intricate weave like a stain that would never fade. The fire in the hearth had long since died, leaving the air thick with the stale scent of charred wood. On a heavy oak side table, a letter sat half open, its edges curled, its surface smudged with something that was not quite ink. And on the floor, stark against the rich fabric, a single lock of chestnut hair gleamed in the slanted light, a detail too deliberate to be mere chance. The police prowled through the house, their measured steps stirring dust that hadn't moved in decades, their voices crisp with authority, but laden with uncertainty. But outside, in the village, speculation had already taken root. Sir Reginald, someone murmured, near the bakery, always hanging about Lady Elena, wasn't he? Too friendly, if you ask me, another voice joined in, laden with meaning. There's been talk, you know, and in the village square, beneath the skeletal stretch of a great beech tree, Sir Reginald stood rigid, his coat collar turned up against the creeping chill, but nothing could shield him from the weight of the eyes watching him. His face, once striking in a sharp and effortless way, was now drawn tight, something unreadable flickering behind his gaze. Across from him, Dr. Whittaker, friend and confidant, studied him with the steady patience of a man accustomed to seeing past the surface. "Keep your head," Whittaker murmured, his voice low, measured. Reginald exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his graying hair. "I didn't kill her," he ground out, the words tight, almost desperate, then softer, with something close to disbelief. "God help me, Whit. I didn't." "I believe you," Whittaker said, his gaze steady. "Doesn't mean they will." Reginald's gaze shifted, drifting toward the looming silhouette of Hemsby Manor. A shadow passed across his face, fleeting, but there. "She was complicated," he admitted, his voice carrying something distant, something buried. "You know how people talk, we were close, yes. But this," he broke off, shaking his head, "this wasn't supposed to happen." Whittaker's eyes flickered toward the gathering whispers, the way the villagers hovered in clusters, their voices sharp as wasp stings. He sighed. "Truth is, Reg, it doesn't matter what was supposed to happen, only what people believe did. And right now, they believed in guilt." Across the street, obscured behind the tea shop's fogged window, Miss Marple watched. A quiet observer, she stirred her tea, her lined face betraying nothing, her eyes keen. People, she always said, were like stitches in a tapestry, watch long enough, and the pattern would show itself. And today, as the sun dipped lower, casting the village in long creeping shadows, she could see the first stitch pulling loose, the first fray in a story that was far from complete. Somewhere, hidden in the folds of speculation and grief, the truth lingered, waiting to be unraveled. And Miss Marple, with her steady hands and unblinking gaze, was already beginning to thread the first needle. A thick fog curled through the cobbled streets of Blackwood Hollow, muting the usual village bustle to a hush. Lights flickered behind lace curtains, shadows shifting as whispers danced between neighbors. At the gilded teapot, the scent of steeping bergamot curled into the air, as the brass bell above the door jangled. Mrs. Pritchard stepped inside, her knitted shawl pulled tight around her stooped shoulders, eyes sharp, despite their age. "Dreadful news," she murmured, though only old Mr. Caldwell sat in the corner, stirring his tea with slow deliberate motions. "The lady of Blackwood Manor, found dead in her study this morning." Caldwell's spoon halted mid-air, trembling in his liver-spotted hand. "Dead?" His voice, thick with disbelief, cracked slightly. "How?" Mrs. Pritchard glanced over her shoulder, as if the walls might listen, before lowering her voice. "They say murder." That word slithered through the village like ink spilled on silk. By midday, speculation churned through the marketplace. The butcher muttered about poison, the baker swore it was a crime of passion, but all eyes turned toward Blackwood Manor, its towering spires clawing at the slate sky. Behind its ivy-clad facade, the truth lay waiting in a room gone cold, A grand mahogany desk stood untouched save for the shattered crystal tumbler by its edge, amber liquid pooling across parchment, bearing a single unfinished word. The fire in the hearth had smoldered to embers, leaving a chill that clung to the damask curtains like something spectral. And there, amid the stillness, a letter, half torn and smudged, its ink barely dry. A promise? A threat? Only one thing was certain: Lady Blackwood had read it. Moments before death claimed her. The police combed through every detail, but the villagers had already cast their own verdicts. "That rogue Everett Blackwood," muttered the apothecary, refilling a jar of valerian root. "Always skulking about." "Too obvious," countered the innkeeper, wiping down the bar. "Mark my words, it's about that inheritance." Across the square, Everett himself stood rigid beneath the skeletal limbs of the old oak, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "I had nothing to do with this," he ground out, his voice low. Opposite him, Dr. Ambrose Whitmore, longtime confidant and keeper of secrets, met his gaze steadily. "That doesn't mean they'll believe you." Everett's breath misted in the evening air. She had enemies. He swallowed hard, eyes flicking toward the manor's looming silhouette. But this wasn't supposed to happen. Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. "It never is." At the far end of the street, Miss Eliza Havisham sipped her lukewarm tea, watching with an expression of quiet calculation. Observation was an art, she often said, and the truth, like a well-knitted pattern, would always reveal itself in time. And this mystery, she thought, setting down her cup, was an exquisitely tangled weave. Darkness crept across the manor grounds as the investigation deepened. In the study, Inspector Graves hovered over the crime scene, his gaze sharp beneath the brim of his hat. His gloved fingers traced the torn letter, noting the indentations beneath the ink, a sign of a trembling hand, of hesitation, or fear. "This wasn't an ordinary correspondence," he muttered. "No," agreed Miss Havisham, stepping forward, her sharp eyes glinting in the dim light. "It was something far more dangerous." Everett stood by the hearth, shadows swallowing the hard angles of his face. "This is a setup," he ground out. Graves turned the letter over, noting the fine, unfamiliar paper. "You're certain this isn't yours?" "I know my own hand," Everett snapped. But the weight of accusation in the room was suffocating. "And yet," Miss Havisham murmured, smoothing a fingertip over the paper's edge, "this script, it mimics yours, Everett, but it's just off. The loops are too forced." As though someone was imitating, the room pulsed with silence. "Forgery," Graves murmured at last, his eyes narrowing. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, a storm brewing in the distance. Somewhere, in the folds of lies and deception, the truth lay coiled, waiting. But Miss Havisham was already pulling at the first thread, unraveling a secret that someone had killed to keep. The storm had broken by morning, but the air in Holloway's Tea Emporium still held the weight of something unspoken. Rain pattered against the windows, streaking the glass, muting the world outside, as though trapping its secrets within. Inside, the scent of orange pekoe and cardamom curled through the air, mingling with the low murmur of voices. The tea room, with its floral wallpaper, once elegant, now fading at the edges, was the kind of place where scandal settled in corners, folded neatly between porcelain cups, and whispered over the clink of silver spoons. At her usual table by the bay window, Miss Eleanor Whitlow sat with a half-knitted shawl pooled in her lap, her needles clicking with mechanical precision. It was a habit, nothing more, something to keep her hands moving, while her mind did the real work. The village was in uproar, though in their quiet, English way. Lord Ashcombe found dead in his study, a letter by his side, its ink still fresh enough to smear. And now everyone in Holloway had their own theories. "Strange business," muttered Mrs. Ainsley, lowering her voice though it would make no difference. "They say it was a lover's quarrel." Across from her, Mrs. Pembroke made a noise of disapproval as she sweetened her tea. Nonsense. The Ashcombs don't have quarrels, they have arrangements. She took a dainty sip, eyes sharp over the rim of her cup. Though I did hear something about a letter, rather scandalous, apparently. Miss Whitlow let the conversation unravel before her, watching as the room absorbed it. Words left their speakers, and found new homes in waiting ears. It was always the way, but her gaze flickered toward the farthest table, where Lady Imogen Ashcombe sat, hands folded, her gloves still on, a quiet defiance. Across from her, Mr. Giles Everleigh stirred his tea with slow, deliberate motions, his fingers betraying the barest tremor. A man choosing his words with caution. The bell above the door chimed, and the hush that followed was as good as a standing ovation. Lucian Radcliffe entered, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed, but carrying the air of a man who would rather be anywhere else. The rain had caught in his dark hair, leaving droplets clinging to his collar, but he paid them no mind. He removed his hat with a slow, measured motion, scanning the room. The air tightened. Miss Whitlow counted the seconds before anyone spoke. 4, 5. Then Lady Imogen lifted her chin. "Mr. Radcliffe," she said, voice smooth as silk drawn over glass. "I wasn't expecting you." He inclined his head, his smile edged with something unreadable. "Unexpected visits have their own charm, don't you think?" His voice, like a well-played violin, carried just enough warmth to distract from the steel beneath. He took a seat, not beside her, but at the table adjacent, close enough to be included, distant enough to make a point. Giles Everleigh set down his spoon, exhaling slowly. "They say there was a letter," he said at last, not quite looking at Radcliffe. Radcliffe's fingers tapped once against the table, a barely there rhythm. "So they do." Silence stretched. A test. Miss Whitlow's needles never paused. Mrs. Pembroke cleared her throat delicately. "It seems rather convenient, doesn't it? A letter appearing just in time to cast suspicion where it's most useful." Lady Imogen's lips pressed together, but she said nothing. Radcliffe chuckled, low, dry. "Convenient for whom?" Another silence. Outside the rain had slowed, but the sky remained heavy, the threat of another downpour lingering, a storm that had yet to pass. Miss Whitlow cast a glance at her stitches. 32, an imperfect number, and as her gaze returned to the tense dance of glances around the tea-room, she thought, so too was this mystery. The wind crept through the narrow lanes of Blackwood Hollow, carrying whispers that never quite belonged to the living. The old inn at the village square stood like a sentinel, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of years and secrets alike. Inside, the scent of damp wool and overbrewed tea hung in the air, mixing with something more elusive, anticipation. Miss Eleanor Whitlow sat near the fireplace, her knitting needles moving in a steady rhythm, though her mind was elsewhere, tracing the edges of a puzzle no one yet realized had been laid before them. Across the dimly lit room, Lady Imogen Fairchild made her entrance, every inch the embodiment of poised ruthlessness, her sapphire hat tilted at an angle too precise to be accidental. Her gaze flicked briefly to the window where, outside, a single gas lamp flickered, casting restless shadows. She ordered black coffee. Not tea, a message in itself. Moments later, the door swung open again, ushering in Radcliffe Henshaw, his coat still speckled with mist. He hesitated, just for a second, before taking a seat 2 tables away from Lady Imogen, a distance measured with careful deliberation. His fingers drummed once against the table before stilling. Miss Whitlow noticed. She noticed everything. "Did you hear, Mrs. Pembroke?" The baker's wife leaned forward, voice hushed but eager. "The will rewritten just before her death left everything to that nephew of hers, the foreign one." "Foreign," scoffed Mrs. Lytton, pursing her lips. "He's from Scotland, hardly a distant land." "Might as well be," Mrs. Pembroke muttered. "And now the poor boy is accused. Convenient, isn't it?" At the corner table, Penelope Reeves barely touched her chamomile tea, her fingers curled tightly around the porcelain handle. Her expression was smooth, but when Lady Imogen murmured something about a letter, her grip tightened, a fraction too fast, a fraction too hard. Miss Whitlow's lips pressed together. The devil was always in the details. Sir Reginald was reckless, Lady Imogen said, her voice as smooth as glass. He played games with affections he should not have. And you of course would never be so foolish, Radcliffe murmured, stirring his tea with slow deliberate motions. I, she said with an air of finality, have always been practical, not kind, not honest, practical. The room hummed with the weight of words left unsaid. The church bells tolled the hour. Outside, darkness deepened, stretching long fingers across cobbled streets. As Miss Whitlow gathered her knitting, she paused by Radcliffe's table. "Careful, Mr. Henshaw," she murmured. "Sugar sweetens but too much spoils the taste." He looked up sharply, catching the glint in her eye. "You always speak in riddles, Miss Whitlow." "Not riddles," she corrected. "Patterns. And when a thread is pulled wrong, the whole thing unravels." The air outside was sharper now, biting through wool and reason alike. Whispers curled in the corners of the village, soft and insistent, truths hidden between the lines of gossip. Some people listened, most did not. Back at her cottage, she put the kettle on, the sound a low familiar hiss. Firelight danced against the walls as she opened her notebook, its worn leather cover soft beneath her fingers. The pen hovered over the page. Lady Imogen, practical, too measured. Indifference is never so carefully crafted, unless there's something to hide. Radcliffe nervous. Watches too much, says too little, knows more than he lets on. But why risk everything for Lady Ilima? Penelope loyal, or afraid, flinched at the mention of the letter. Why? The wind rattled the windows, impatient. Miss Whitlow tapped the pen against her chin. Greed, jealousy, fear, love turned bitter, the usual motives. But love was messy, and this was calculated. Somewhere in the village, a candle flickered in a window, faint, desperate, a silent plea. Not everyone slept soundly when secrets lurked in the dark. The morning air clung to Blackwood Hollow, like an old ghost, thick with the scent of damp earth and something more elusive, unspoken truths. In the heart of the village, nestled between a sagging bookshop and the apothecary, with its ever-dusty windows, the willow and finch tea-house stirred to life. Eleanor Whitlow sat at her usual corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of now cooling tea, her mind weaving through the tangle of whispers and half-truths that had settled over the village like fog. Across the room, Lady Imogen Fairchild's presence was a sharpened blade, cold and deliberate, her gloved fingers tapping against the porcelain rim of her untouched coffee. Outside, the gas lamps still flickered from the night's storm, their glow casting long shadows along the cobbled streets where Radcliffe Henshaw stood, watching too long, too intently, before finally stepping inside. A deliberate hesitation. Miss Whitlow did not miss it. "Such a shame, Mrs. Pembroke murmured to no one in particular, though her voice carried easily in the hushed space. To go like that, and in her own home no less. And so suddenly, added Mrs. Lytton, her spoon clinking once-twice against the rim of her teacup. "Though I suppose suddenness suits some people, doesn't it?" Lady Imogen did not look up, but her lips twitched, amusement, annoyance. Hard to say. Radcliffe, however, stiffened, barely perceptible. Across the table, Penelope Reeves' hands remained poised over her saucer, her grip just a shade too tight. "The will," Mrs. Pembroke continued, her voice dropping just enough to make others lean in. "Rewritten, everything to the nephew, the one from across the border. Scotland, Mrs. Lytton said with a huff. "Hardly the ends of the earth, might as well be." Mrs. Pembroke sniffed. "And now look, the poor boy's accused. Convenient, isn't it?" The fire in the hearth cracked, sending a sharp pop into the silence. Lady Imogen lifted her coffee to her lips but did not drink. Forgery requires two things, Miss Whitlow murmured, as if to herself, skill and intent. One's easier to find than the other. The flames in the fireplace shifted, a log settling as if in agreement. Miss Whitlow closed her notebook, fingers trailing along its well-worn spine. Patterns, that's all mysteries were, tangled yarn, waiting to be teased apart. And if there was one thing she knew, it was how to find the thread that pulled the whole mess loose. Outside, the village stretched beneath the weight of morning, the fog clinging stubbornly to hedgerows and stone walls. Miss Whitlow's boots clicked a steady rhythm against the damp streets, each step bringing her closer to the cemetery, not for the dead. No, the dead rarely had much left to say. It was the living who held the real intrigue. Near the wrought iron gate, rusted with time and sorrow, Mrs. Webb stood motionless, her black shawl clinging to her shoulders like mourning itself. In her hands, a bouquet of wilted daisies trembled slightly. Terrible business, Mrs. Whitlow offered lightly, to die like that, in one's own home. Awful, Mrs. Webb agreed, though her sharp eyes flicked to the side, as if weighing how much more to say. Not that I'm one for gossip. Of course not. Miss Whitlow tilted her head slightly. But they say Lady Eleanor had enemies. Family quarrels, you know. Money changes people, reveals them, Mrs. Webb corrected, her lips twitching in something too dry to be a smile. Not changes. Always found that to be true. Her gaze drifted to the fresh flowers laid upon Eleanor's grave, petals still bright, the arrangement too neat. Funny how grief brought out sudden fondness in those who had hardly spoken to the dead while they were alive. And Lady Imogen. Miss Whitlow let the name settle, watching for the shift, the hesitation. It came, just slightly. Proud, Mrs. Webb mused. Always thought the manor should have been hers. Didn't sit well, Eleanor holding the purse strings. Pride, resentment, fertile ground for all manner of wrongdoing. The next stop, Sir Reginald's residence. Ivy clung to the brick like an old dog to a favourite blanket. The door swung open, after 3 sharp knocks, revealing a man who looked like sleep had been more suggestion than reality. His tie was askew, his hair unsettled. "If you've come to accuse me, Miss Whitlow, nothing of the sort," she smiled, stepping past him into the sitting room, where the scent of whiskey and old paper lingered. A glass sat half empty on the sideboard. A newspaper, its corners dog-eared, blared its headline in thick black ink. "Murder at Blackwood Manor. Scandal unfolds." Reginald sank into his armchair, exhaling slowly. She was a complicated woman, Eleanor, knew how to twist people around her finger. His gaze flickered toward the fireplace, where ashes rested cold. "And that blasted letter. Someone wants me ruined. Do you know who?" The fire cracked again, a burst of embers glowing briefly before fading into black. Miss Whitlow merely smiled. The pieces had started to shift into place. The night had settled over Blackwood Hollow with an eerie deliberation, as though the village itself was holding its breath. Eleanor Whitlow moved through the quiet lanes, her steps soundless against the damp cobblestones, thoughts flickering like candle flames in a draught. The manor loomed ahead, its silhouette sharp against the bruised purple sky, a monolith of secrets. She hadn't intended to stop, but instinct, persistent whispering, drew her toward the servants' entrance. The kitchen door groaned open, and the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with something more acrid, something old and stale, fear. Inside, Mrs. Greaves stood like a statue of disapproval, her iron-grey hair pulled so tight it might have been stitched to her scalp. "Miss Whitlow," she greeted, her voice a clipped blade. "I won't take much of your time," Eleanor murmured, studying the woman's hands still dusted with flour. Greaves wiped them against her apron, the gesture revealing a tension that did not belong to the mere act of baking. "Not much to tell." "Oh, I imagine there's plenty." Eleanor glanced around. Houses like this, walls listen. Doors remember, a pause, a long one. Then a sigh, resigned, frayed at the edges. It's that passage, isn't it? Eleanor's pulse quickened, but her expression did not shift. Passage, old thing. Runs from the library to the study, forgotten mostly. Mrs. Greaves' voice dropped, brittle as dead leaves. But the other night, I heard footsteps. Quiet, not enough to fool these ears. Eleanor let the silence stretch, testing its weight. Anyone else know? Only family. Mrs. Greaves hesitated, eyes flicking toward the corridor, as if ghosts might be listening. And maybe that Finley fellow, always poking about with papers. Finley again. Eleanor filed the name away, her mind threading connections, tracing patterns. Mrs. Greaves pressed her lips into a thin line. Lady Eleanor used it. Used to eavesdrop. Eleanor mused. She said it kept people honest. Mrs. Greaves sniffed. Or gave her an advantage. Outside, dusk painted the village in smudged greys, the skeletal trees casting long shadows across the ground. Eleanor stepped into the cold, flipping open her notebook. Secret passage. Access to study. Letter planted. Opportunity. Her pen scratched swiftly. Who benefits from Reginald's ruin? Beatrice, inheritance. Finley, debts. Penelope, loyalty. Or something else. The passage suggested more than a crime of impulse. It suggested knowledge, premeditation. Someone who knew the house well enough to slip through its veins unseen. A wind stirred, rustling the pages before Eleanor snapped the notebook shut. Patterns. Always patterns. And now she was beginning to see the weave. Evening deepened into a hush, the village exhaling the last remnants of daylight. Lamps flickered on, spilling golden puddles onto the slick stones, their glow barely holding back the weight of the dark. Shops had shuttered, their windows reflecting only empty streets. Footsteps became fewer, voices softer, everything settling into the calm of silence that made secrets feel heavier. Eleanor didn't mind. Night had a way of loosening tongues and tightening alibis. More importantly, it stripped away the sheen of appearances. People wore their true faces after dusk, mistaking shadow for privacy. Foolish notion. Her boots crunched along the gravel path winding toward the village green. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she welcomed it, the sharp air keeping her thoughts crisp, her focus keen. The letter. Too perfect to be careless, too deliberate to be an accident. The forgery had been precise, not just in handwriting, but in timing, placement, intent, and then the passage. A relic from another age, hidden behind shelves of leather-bound deception, and generations of whispered betrayals. Who knew of it? Family, of course. Finley perhaps. Someone who understood that walls in old houses listened. Eleanor's lips curved slightly, as she recalled Beatrice's words from earlier that day. Eleanor always enjoyed games. I for one prefer clarity. A statement that said absolutely nothing while sounding terribly important. Beatrice was clever. Not as clever as she thought, perhaps, but clever enough to keep a blade tucked behind her silk smile. And Finley twitchy, defensive Finley, too desperate for comfort, too careless for murder. No, the hand that had forged that letter had been steady, calculated, and that meant the truth wasn't a matter of if, but when. The wind carried whispers through the narrow streets of Blackwood Hollow, threading between shuttered windows and winding around the crooked sign at the village green. EST. 1784, the letters carved deep into the wood, weathered by years of rain and rumor. Ivy clung stubbornly to its edges, creeping and insidious, like the gossip that burrowed into every home, into every mind. Eleanor Whitlow paused before it, her breath a silvered ghost against the cold air. A quaint little village, charming in its decay, but she had long since learned that places like this, places that dressed themselves in lace curtains and friendly nods, hid their rot beneath polished surfaces. Cities flaunted their corruption. Villages perfected the art of burying it alive. Her gaze lifted to the distant silhouette of Whitlow Manor, its grey stone walls dark against the dusk, windows staring blankly at the village below. A single lie had been planted like a seed, and now the roots of deceit spread deep, curling through old grudges, tangled in the quiet malice that festered behind closed doors. One murder, one letter, one thread pulled free, and now the entire pattern threatened to unravel. It should not have been her concern. Inspector Gray would trudge through facts, collect testimonies riddled with half-truths, and stumble over the carefully laid red herrings. But the thing about patterns was this: once you glimpsed the weave, you couldn't look away. Quick with denials, too slow with eye contact. Guilt wore many faces, but Finley's was an ill-fitted mask of both shame and fear. Debts were a strong motive. Money made people do things shame wouldn't, and Finley had more desperation than good sense. Then there was Penelope, soft-voiced, steadfast Penelope, who had clung to Lady Eleanor's every word like a disciple. People did not idolize the cruel without reason. Either they had suffered under their hand, or they had seen something that twisted admiration into complicity. A dog barked in the fog, sharp and twice, but Eleanor did not flinch. Her gloved fingers traced absently over the pages of her notebook as she turned toward the manor, boots crunching against the frost-laced ground. Beatrice. Inheritance. Pride sharpened to a fine edge. Finley. Money. Desperation wrapped in excuses. Penelope. Loyalty or guilt, perhaps both. And then there was Reginald. A scapegoat, a fool, possibly both. Greed left footprints, paper trails, accounts to verify, and the passage, the hidden artery of the manor, a secret to some, a weapon to others, who had used it, who had benefited. Her pen hovered over the last line, then pressed down with quiet finality. Everyone lies. Not everyone hides it well. The manor loomed ahead, an ancient thing standing stiff-backed against the sky. The ivy that crawled up its walls did not seem decorative but possessive, strangling the stone like fingers around a throat. The wind cut sharp as Eleanor tightened her scarf, gaze flicking to the lanterns that flickered in the high windows. "Places like this hold grudges longer than people," she murmured. Inspector Gray, standing beside her, grunted, his boots grinding against the gravel. "Houses don't kill people, Miss Whitlow." She allowed herself the faintest of smiles. "No, but they hide things rather well." Inside, the air was thick with old wealth and older secrets. The scent of polished wood and faded roses curled into the must of damp stone. Velvet drapes sagged at the windows, pulling the light into something dull, as if the house itself resented illumination. In the foyer, Mrs. Graves stood as immovable as the manor itself, apron crisp, hands folded tightly before her. A housekeeper was always a repository of knowledge. The question was whether she would share it. Eleanor met her gaze and let the silence stretch. Then, with a slow, deliberate turn of the page in her notebook, she spoke. "Tell me, Mrs. Graves, do houses listen as well as they keep secrets?" The air between them tensed, and in the distant corridors of Whitlow Manor, something shifted in the shadows. Tonight, the truth would slip between the cracks, and she would be there to catch it. The corridor stretched long and silent, thick with the scent of aged varnish and secrets too old to speak. The housekeeper's lips pressed into a line sharp enough to draw blood. "You'll find what you need in the East Wing," she said, her voice clipped, the sort of tone that left no room for argument. Not much use to anyone these days. Lady Eleanor preferred the West Parlour, said the East Wing was full of drafts and ghosts. Eleanor Whitlow arched a brow. Ghosts rarely pen letters. The housekeeper didn't smile, wouldn't be so sure. The words clung to the air like damp wool as they made their way down the hall, following the creaking floorboards to a seldom-used wing where the past hung thick in the dust and the portraits lining the walls. Faces frozen in oil and age, watching with that peculiar mix of aristocratic detachment and knowing. "We know things you never will." Eleanor's gaze lingered on one, a woman with a thin mouth and eyes like cut glass. The family resemblance was strong. Blood runs deep in houses like this. Funny place for this one, isn't it? Inspector Gray muttered, stopping before a portrait that hung just a little off-center. A tarnished plaque read S.P. Hensley. Doesn't match the rest. Eleanor stepped closer, gloved fingers tracing the ornate frame. Her touch found what her eyes had already guessed, a faint notch along the edge. She pressed it, a groan, deep and shuddering, like an old man rising from a chair. The portrait swung open, revealing a narrow doorway cut into the wall. She exhaled, almost amused. Isn't that theatrical? Gray gave a dry huff. Secret passage, like something out of a cheap novel, or a well-planned alibi. The passage yawned before them, dark and cool, thick with the scent of damp stone and forgotten things. Dust lay undisturbed, except for a few scuffs, barely noticeable. Someone had been here, but not recently. Cobwebs stretched across the entrance, disturbed now as Gray pushed through, his gloved hand sweeping them aside. Inside the walls closed in, rough stone grazing their shoulders. The candelabra in Gray's hand threw wild flickering shadows that danced along the narrow confines. A house like this ran on whispers and silver trays. Built for servants most likely, Gray muttered, his voice hushed by the tight space. Eleanor's lips curled slightly. They still are. The silver just changes hands. A dozen steps in, Gray paused. Something had snagged his boot. He crouched, pulling up a torn piece of dark cloth, its edges frayed from a fresh tear. Fabric, he murmured. Men's suiting, I'd wager. Eleanor said, inspecting it. Quality, but worn. Her gaze slid sideways. Remind you of anyone's wardrobe? Gray's jaw tightened. Finley wears a suit like this. Yes, she mused, but so does half the village on Sundays. They pressed forward. The passage sloped downward, the damp air thickening. The stones grew slick beneath their steps, and then an alcove, just large enough for someone to stand and listen. The walls bore faint scratches, deliberate, not decorative. Directions. Gray ran his fingers over them. Someone's been using this. Eleanor's gaze caught something lower on the wall, a dark smudge, ink, fresh enough to smear under her glove. The letter, she murmured. Same ink, Gray exhaled sharply. Finley, again, possibly, she tilted her head. But ink can be borrowed, motives less so. They moved on. The passage ended behind a wooden panel that opened with a careful nudge, spilling them into the Lady Eleanor's sanctuary, and more recently, her tomb. The air was different here, thick with lingering perfume, the ghost of aged brandy curling at the edges. Nothing had been touched since the police sealed the room. The shattered tea remained where it had fallen, a memory frozen in porcelain shards. Eleanor's eyes roved the space. So easy to frame someone when you control the setting. Gray frowned, meaning, whoever planted that letter knew how to get in and out unseen, she murmured. They left just enough evidence to point at Reginald, and perhaps at Finley. Gray's gaze sharpened. Too neat, wouldn't you say? His nod was slow, thoughtful. Red herring, or a well-laid trap. The candlelight flickered, throwing shifting patterns across the book-lined walls. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane, a skeletal branch tapping against the glass, as if the house itself had something to say. The flickering candlelight died with a whisper, plunging the chamber into darkness, so thick it felt like a living thing pressing in. Inspector Gray straightened, slipping the torn fabric into an evidence pouch, his voice low, deliberate. We're close. Eleanor Whitlow's smile was razor thin. Close is when people make mistakes, or when they get desperate. The room seemed to hold its breath around them, the stillness deceptive. Then, with a final glance at the ink-stained desk, the shattered porcelain, and the hidden door that had betrayed its existence with a reluctant creak, they stepped into the corridor. The passage sealed itself behind them, swallowing their presence as if they had never been there at all. But the house was never silent. Houses like this never were. The air in the Hemsworth police station carried the stale ghosts of damp wood, old tobacco, and too many overbrewed teas. The brass clock on the wall ticked with a measured patience, marking each second like a noose tightening around a secret. In the back room, meant more for missing dogs and feuding neighbors than murder and conspiracy, an oak table groaned beneath the weight of blueprints, witness statements, and speculations stacked like kindling waiting for a match. Gray had long since loosened his tie, though now it hung forgotten, a weary strand over his shoulder. Across from him, Eleanor sat poised, her coat draped over the back of her chair, gloves neatly folded. Her notebook lay open, ink scrawled in lines sharp enough to slice through deception. "Let's make sense of it," Gray muttered, rubbing at his temples. "Before the whole damn village convinces itself this was the work of spirits." Eleanor's eyes glinted, a flicker of something almost amused. "Ghosts, Inspector? I thought you didn't believe in fairy tales." "I don't," he grunted. "But I believe people will tell themselves anything to sleep at night." On the table, the forged love letter rested under the weight of suspicion, its ink still theatrically dark, every flourish crafted too deliberately. Beside it, a torn scrap of wool fabric, edges frayed, plucked from a hidden corridor, the architectural blueprints of Whitmore Manor, their parchment curling with age, revealed a web of clandestine passageways threading through the estate, like veins in a body. And then names, motives, scribbled notes that wove a tangled narrative of debt, inheritance, and the kind of secrets that never stayed buried. Gray tapped a finger against the letter, handwriting's close to Finley's, but the librarian swears the strokes are just off. Whoever wrote this tried too hard to mimic Reginald's style. A forgery meant to be found isn't just about resemblance, Eleanor murmured. It's about timing, placement, theatrics. Her gaze slid to the blueprints, which brings us to the passage. Why leave the letter there? Why not somewhere simpler? To frame Reginald, Gray said. Obvious, isn't it? Obvious, she agreed. But obvious isn't always correct. Her gloved fingertip traced the inked corridors on the blueprint, pausing over the place where the fabric had been found. Good quality wool, not uncommon. But the color, the weave, distinctive. Gray flipped through photographs until he found the one taken at Whitmore Manor's last gathering. Lady Beatrice, standing near the terrace, a dark wool coat draped over her shoulders. "Matches hers," he said grimly. "Convenient," Eleanor murmured. "Perhaps too convenient." Gray exhaled, shaking his head. "You think she's being framed?" "She's proud," Eleanor said. "Not careless, and prideful people don't leave breadcrumbs unless they want someone to follow." Silence settled between them, thick with unspoken conclusions. Outside, the village exhaled into the hush of the late hour, lanterns dimming, doors locking against the cold and against the truth. Gray rapped his knuckles against the table. Finley had motive, money troubles. Beatrice had motive. Inheritance. Penelope. Well, she had loyalty to Eleanor, but that doesn't always translate to murder. "Loyalty turns sour," Eleanor said, flipping a page in her notebook. "But let's consider opportunity." Finley knew the house. He knew the passage existed. Beatrice knew too, but she prefers more direct methods. And Reginald. "Reginald's too transparent," she said. "Guilt makes a poor mask for murder. He's convenient, but so is a scapegoat." Gray's gaze swept the table, the weight of evidence pressing down like a second gravity. "Everything points to," but before he could finish, the station door creaked open, and the cold night air curled inward. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the lamplight, watching, listening. And just like that, the quiet wasn't quiet anymore. The candlelight wavered, casting restless shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the walls. Inspector Harrington's eyes flicked to the torn scrap of fabric in his gloved hand, slipping it into an evidence pouch with a quiet finality. "Beatrice, or Finley," he murmured, voice taut with calculation. Across the room Evelyn Whitmore sat poised, her expression calm but eyes sharp with thought. "Perhaps both," she said softly, her words carrying weight. "Or perhaps we've been looking at it from the wrong angle." Harrington frowned, his mind passing possibilities. "Go on." Evelyn's fingers brushed the ink-stained paper before her, the forgery that had been placed too conveniently. The letter was meant to frame Reginald, yes, but it was also meant to direct attention to whoever found it. People focus on the accused, they overlook the one who reveals the crime. Her gaze was steady, and people rarely question the loyal, they question the ambitious, the indebted. A slow realization unfurled in Harrington's mind. Penelope. His voice was low. She had access, proximity, and reason. Eleanor's protection was both a gift and a cage, and cages breed resentment. Evelyn nodded, eyes dark with understanding. "Freedom," she said, "is a powerful motive." Harrington exhaled, leaning back in his chair, the weight of possibility settling on his shoulders. "You're saying the quiet, unassuming companion forged the letter, used the passage, staged everything?" Evelyn tapped her notebook, closed with a decisive snap. "I'm saying people aren't always what they seem." A beat of silence stretched between them, broken only by the relentless ticking of the brass clock on the wall. Tick, tock. Time pressing forward. Truth. Waiting. Harrington's fingers drummed against the tabletop. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "we confront them." Evelyn's lips curved faintly. "Tomorrow," she agreed. The moment lingered, a fragile stillness on the cusp of unraveling. They were close. So close that the air itself felt charged, thick with the kind of anticipation that made people reckless, the kind that drew out desperation, the kind that forced mistakes. Evelyn's voice was almost a whisper. One last piece, hidden in plain sight. Outside, the village signs swayed in the wind, creaking like bones settling. Inside, two investigators sat in the dim glow of a single lamp, staring at the fragments of a lie waiting for dawn. When the sun rose, there would be no more shadows to hide in, no more masks to wear, no more deceptions to weave. By the time the world woke, the truth would be laid bare. The courtroom was a monolithic thing, old and heavy with the weight of 1,000 verdicts. The oak-paneled walls smelled of varnish and whispered secrets. The brass fixtures dulled by decades of quiet judgment. Stained glass windows spilled fractured light onto the gallery, painting those who had gathered in muted reds and blues, like figures in some forgotten masterpiece. The air was thick, not just with dust and age, but with something intangible, something electric, anticipation. Fear, hunger. People didn't come to court for justice. They came for spectacle. Evelyn sat in the third row, a position chosen for its careful balance between visibility and discretion. Her hat, modest but precise, cast a soft shadow over her expression as she scanned the room. The villagers pressed close together, whispered in hushed excitement. City journalists, eyes gleaming with the promise of scandal, leaned forward in expectation. The tension curled in the air like smoke before a flame. At the front, Reginald sat in the dock, his posture composed but weary. His suit, though tailored, sagged at the shoulders under the weight of sleepless nights and whispered accusations. His once charming features were hollowed, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He didn't fidget, didn't shift. His fingers, interlocked on the table before him, were the only sign of strain, the faint whiteness at his knuckles betraying the effort to hold himself together. The judge, a broad-shouldered man with a wig that looked as though it had weathered one too many trials, cleared his throat, the sound rolling through the chamber like distant thunder. "Prosecution," he intoned, his voice a measured rumble. "You may proceed." A young barrister in crisp black robes rose from his seat, his movements smooth with confidence. The light caught on the lenses of his spectacles, turning them momentarily opaque. He smiled, a smile that had been practiced in polished mirrors and lecture halls. "Your Honor," he began, voice rich and precise, "ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are gathered here today to consider the damning evidence against Sir Reginald Pembroke. His words were slow, deliberate, each syllable laid down like a carefully placed chess piece. Evidence that suggests not only motive, but action. He lifted a sealed document, its contents visible through the plastic sleeve. The linchpin of this case, he declared, is this letter. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room. A declaration of love, turned to obsession, words that led tragically to Lady Eleanor Whitmore's untimely death. He let the silence stretch, let the gravity of his statement settle into the bones of the crowd. Evelyn's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap, the only sound in the courtroom's hush. To the astute, the performance was clear. A good prosecutor understood that half the battle was theatre, but too much drama risked burning the truth. Her fingers tightened briefly on the yarn, because the truth, she suspected, had yet to be spoken. The letter was a lie, but the real question was, who had written it, and who in the end would pay the price? The letter passed from hand to hand, jurors bending over it like scholars studying a relic, their expressions shifting between skepticism and intrigue. A woman in the front row gasped, whether at the words themselves or their implications, no one could tell. The prosecutor turned sharply toward the defendant, his voice smooth, polished, honed for persuasion. "Sir Reginald," he said, his tone a perfect balance of patience and pressure, "do you deny writing this letter?" The courtroom seemed to tighten around the moment. Reginald's voice, though hoarse from days of tension, was steady. "I do." A flicker of something unease or amusement passed across the prosecutor's face. "And yet," he continued, voice slipping into measured condescension, "the handwriting is remarkably similar to yours. The language intimate, the passion undeniable." A pause, a deliberate inhale before the knife twisted. "You expect us to believe you felt nothing for Lady Eleanor?" Reginald's jaw clenched. "I didn't write it," he repeated, steel threading through his tone, "and I never loved her." A ripple ran through the crowd, half scandalized, half delighted. Love turned sour, made for better gossip than murder ever could. The defense attorney, a stout man with the weathered patience of one accustomed to uphill battles, pushed himself to his feet. "Your Honor, we dispute the authenticity of this letter. Handwriting analysis is inconclusive, and there is no direct evidence linking my client to the crime scene." The judge, a heavy-set figure whose robe draped like battle-worn armor, grunted. "Noted. Continue." And so the parade began, witnesses stepping forward like actors hitting their marks, each delivering their lines with varying degrees of conviction. Lady Beatrice, cold and precise, testified with clipped detachment. "Reginald was reckless," she said, a note of satisfaction curling in her words. "Eleanor indulged him foolishly so." Her gaze flicked to the defendant, a touch of something unreadable in her eyes. Truth or performance? The question hung unanswered. Then came Finlay, nervous, damp with sweat, his eyes darting as though the walls themselves were whispering accusations. "I just found the letter," he stammered. "In her desk. I thought it seemed important." His hands clenched, released, clenched again, a rhythm of unease. Miss Evelyn Whitmore, seated toward the back, noted the movement with keen interest. People lied with their mouths. Their fingers told the truth. Penelope was last, pale but composed. She moved like someone walking a tightrope. "Lady Eleanor was kind to me," she said softly. Sir Reginald took advantage of that kindness. Her words were careful, each syllable placed like stepping stones across treacherous waters. Evelyn's brow furrowed, not at what she was saying but at what she was avoiding. Then came the cross-examinations, a dance of legal sparring dressed in civility, but sharp enough to wound. The defense attacked the letter's inconsistencies. The prosecution painted a picture of Reginald as a jealous, desperate man. Accusations flew, some hitting their mark, others glancing off. The hours stretched, the weight of the trial pressing against the walls. The clock ticked. The air thickened. The judge finally exhaled, rubbing his temple. Closing remarks tomorrow, he announced, his gavel falling with the finality of a coffin lid. The gallery stirred, murmurs swelling into waves. Outside, cameras flashed, voices rose, no answers were given, no truths were spoken. Evelyn lingered, her gaze fixed on the empty witness stand. The pieces were scattered, yes, but they were forming a shape, almost, not quite. One piece left, hidden in plain sight. Gathering her things, she glanced at Reginald being led away. Their eyes met just for a moment, just long enough for her to see the frayed edges of a man unraveling. Tomorrow, the truth would stand, whether anyone liked it or not. The courtroom had its own air, dense, stagnant, thick with tension and whispered judgment. It smelled of old varnish, ink, and the sweat of the accused. The wooden benches groaned under the weight of villagers pressed shoulder to shoulder, drawn like moths to the glow of scandal. Lawyers shuffled papers. A woman in the gallery dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though whether for grief or theatrical effect, no one could say. Evelyn sat toward the back, her knitting untouched in her lap. She watched, not just the words spoken, but the shifts, the glances, the tells. People spoke with their bodies long before their mouths caught up. At the front, Finley took the stand, his fingers twitching, his breath coming too fast. He tugged at his collar, sweat beading despite the courtroom's chill. His eyes darted, not to the judge, not to the jury, but to Lady Beatrice, seated primly at the prosecution's table. They did not exchange a glance, but there was a story in that silence. The young prosecutor rose, his voice smooth as polished silver. "Mr. Finley," he began, "you claim to have discovered the letter. Describe the circumstances." Finley swallowed. I was organizing Lady Eleanor's papers. She asked me to look into some financial ledgers. I opened a drawer in her writing desk, and it was just there, the prosecutor repeated, letting the words settle like dust. "And your immediate thought was to bring it to the authorities?" "Yes, It seemed important." Finley's fingers twisted in his lap, knuckles whitening. Evelyn's gaze narrowed. Was it nerves, guilt, or something worse? The air shifted, the walls listened, and somewhere in the depths of the trial, the real truth lay waiting. The defense attorney rose, his build solid, voice less polished than the prosecutor's, but weighted with experience. "Mr. Finch," he said, fixing the nervous witness with a measured stare, "how long had you been in Miss Davenport's employ?" 6 months, Finch replied, voice thin. "And in that time did you have access to her personal correspondence?" A hesitant nod. "Yes, but answer the question directly, please." Finch swallowed. "Yes. So it wouldn't be difficult for you to insert a letter where it didn't belong." Objections rose, but the judge silenced them with a wave of his hand. The suggestion, however, lingered in the air like gunpowder after a shot. Finch's face crumpled. "I didn't forge anything," he stammered, but the words rang hollow. No one seemed fully convinced. Next to take the stand was Lady Eleanor's sister Lavinia, regale in black crepe and pearls, her demeanor a masterclass in aristocratic control. Every movement measured, every word a scalpel. The prosecutor's questions slid off her like rain against stone. "You were close to Miss Davenport, as close as two sisters can be," Lavinia murmured, a faint smile curving her lips. "Which is to say, not very. And how did you feel about her engagement to Mr. Redgrave?" Her eyes flicked to the defendant, brief, dismissive. "My feelings are irrelevant." Eleanor had her own mind. The defense attorney leaned forward, his voice sharper. "Lady Lavinia, did you stand to gain financially from your sister's death?" "Certainly not." She barely blinked. "My inheritance was settled long ago." "Yet you knew about the secret passageways in the manor." "I grew up in that house, sir. Of course I knew, but you never used them." A pause, a breath. "Childish nonsense," she said, but her gaze hardened. The moment stretched. "Miss Grey, the quiet observer seated toward the back, catching the flicker of something beneath the surface. Not a lie, precisely, but not the truth. People like Lavinia built walls from half-truths, fortresses that hid more than they revealed. Then came Mr. Redgrave's turn. A man once composed, now unraveling by degrees. His voice, steady at first, wavered beneath cross-examination. "You expect us to believe," the prosecutor sneered, "that despite your documented affection for Miss Davenport, you never wrote her a letter of this nature." "I never wrote that letter," Redgrave snapped, frustration crackling in his voice, "and I certainly didn't. You were seen arguing with her the night before her death." "A disagreement," Redgrave shot back. "Nothing more." Miss Grey studied the jury's faces, how easily they latched onto the idea of a lover's quarrel turned deadly. Too easy. When recess came, murmurs filled the air, mixing with the scent of ink and burning tobacco. Miss Grey stepped into a side corridor, where a young barrister stood waiting, his suit too neat, his eyes too restless. "Miss Grey," he said. A quick nod. He held out a folded document, his voice dropping. "I found something." She unfolded the paper, scanning the text, her lips pressed together. "It changes everything," he whispered. "It's from the solicitor's office, a codicil to Miss Davenport's will." "Let me guess," she murmured, eyes sharp. "A substantial inheritance." He nodded. The majority of her estate was to go to Miss Sutton, if Eleanor remained unmarried. Miss Grey let out a quiet breath, and she was about to change that to Mr. Redgrave, the barrister confirmed, but if he had died before the marriage was finalized, Penelope Sutton would keep everything. Miss Grey's gaze flicked toward the courtroom doors. Greed wasn't always about gaining more. Sometimes, it was about not losing what one already had. When court resumed, the air in the room felt charged, thick with anticipation. The gallery stirred as Miss Grey stood. Heads turned, the prosecutor frowned. The defense lawyer blinked. The judge's brows lifted. "Miss Grey?" Surprise flickered across his face. "Do you have something to add?" She stepped forward, hands steady, voice calm but edged like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Your Honor, I believe I can clarify the events surrounding Miss Davenport's death." A hush fell over the room. Chairs scraped. Whispers slithered through the gallery like restless ghosts. "The truth," she said simply, "has been hiding in plain sight." The clock struck noon, its chime ringing through the courtroom like the toll of a distant bell. There was a peculiar stillness, the kind that settles before a storm breaks, breathless, waiting. And as Miss Grey stood there, her unassuming presence masking a mind sharper than any dagger, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. The courtroom held its breath as Miss Grey stepped forward, a woman of sharp eyes and sharper wits, standing before a sea of people who thought they already knew the truth. The judge, his robes weighted with authority and dust, gave her a nod. "Proceed." She adjusted her gloves, her gaze sweeping the room. Mr. Ashford, pale and unraveling, sat rigidly in the dock. The secretary, Mr. Collins, hands clenched tight, refused to meet her eyes. Miss Lane's face was a portrait of dread, while Lady Winfield, impeccable and composed, offered a smile that never touched her eyes. Miss Grey's voice was steady, yet carried the weight of finality. "It is often said that the simplest explanation is the correct one. But simplicity," she continued, her gaze locking onto the jury, "is a deceiver. It lulls us into accepting the obvious while obscuring the truth." A murmur rippled through the gallery, a rustle of fabric, a creak of wooden benches. No one interrupted. "From the beginning this case has been draped in misdirection," she continued. "A forged letter of passion and betrayal, an easy story, a tempting one. But details, those stubborn insistent details, they tell a different tale." She raised a scrap of fabric, its edges frayed. This was found in the hidden passage behind Lady Evelyn's study, a passage known to few, used not to commit the crime, but to stage its scene. Because, you see, Lady Evelyn was not killed in a fit of passion, nor in a violent struggle. No, she was poisoned, slowly, subtly. The room stirred, unease rolling like distant thunder. Lady Winfield's lawyer rose to object, but Miss Grey spoke over him, her voice like a blade wrapped in silk. Lady Winfield owns a coat made from this very fabric. She claims no involvement, but consider this: she had motive. Financial, yes, but deeper than that. Resentment festers over years, but greed has a timetable. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. With Lady Evelyn alive, the estate remained beyond reach. But a scandal, an affair suggested in a conveniently discovered letter, that was enough to destroy reputations, disinherit heirs, and turn public sentiment like the tide. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Lady Winfield's lips pressed into a thin line, the first crack in her composure. And Mr. Collins, Miss Grey turned to him, eyes unwavering. The letter was forged, not out of loyalty, but desperation. Gambling debts, as Inspector Hale discovered. A man squeezed from both ends will do anything to escape ruin. He planted the letter at Lady Winfield's instruction, and used the passageway to avoid detection. Simple, efficient, devastatingly effective. Colin's head dropped into his hands. A taut string snapped in the air, the tension fracturing like glass. And how, Miss Grey continued, her voice softer now, was Lady Evelyn murdered? A beat of silence, then arsenic, found in her teacup, a common enough poison, kept in the manor's garden shed. But the tea, her eyes flicked toward Miss Lane, the lady's companion. The tea was prepared by someone she trusted. The room froze. And who, Miss Grey asked, voice light but unyielding, stood to lose everything, if Lady Evelyn married? Miss Lane let out a strangled sob. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "She said it wouldn't kill her, just make her ill, just enough to stop the wedding. But intent," Miss Grey said gently, "is a frail defense, and death does not care for intentions." The judge's gavel struck wood. "Order, order in this court." Lady Winfield rose, voice cold. "You believe I orchestrated this for money?" "No," Miss Grey replied, watching her. "For power. Money is merely the tool. Control was your aim." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Miss Lane wept into gloved hands. Mr. Ashford, long accused, closed his eyes, relief washing over him in waves. The judge cleared his throat. "In light of this evidence, charges will be reconsidered. This court is adjourned, pending further investigation." Outside, the world erupted. Reporters swarmed like hornets stirred from their nest. Flashbulbs burst like gunfire. By morning, the scandal would fill the papers. But Miss Grey, stepping onto the cold cobbled streets, merely exhaled, watching her breath curl into the night air. Inspector Hale caught up with her, shaking his head. "Never fails," he muttered. "It's always the quiet ones." Miss Grey gave a faint smile. "People reveal who they are, Inspector, if you watch closely enough." And with that, she disappeared into the fog, leaving the echoes of her revelations behind. The courtroom exhaled in the stillness that followed, the weight of truth settling like dust after a storm. Miss Harrington stood composed, her gloved hands clasped before her, her work done. Around her, lives unraveled in slow motion. Sir Malcolm, long accused, now free but forever altered, kept his gaze low, as if uncertain how to reclaim his place in a world that had already condemned him. Mr. Wright, whose trembling hands had once feigned innocence, now sat motionless, guilt draped over him like a heavy shroud. Mrs. Armitage, elegant even in disgrace, remained upright, lips pressed so tightly they could have drawn blood. And Miss Connolly, so timid, so unassuming, wept quietly into her palms, the weight of her choices unraveling like the hem of a forgotten dress. Then the murmurs began, a low, simmering hum, rippling through the gallery like wind through dying leaves. Memory replayed in the minds of all present, shifting the lens through which they had once viewed the accused. Mr. Wright's anxious glances, once dismissed as nerves, were now recognized as the desperate twitchings of a man caught in his own snare. Mrs. Armitage's regal bearing no longer spoke of dignity, but of calculation, of a woman who had mastered the art of concealing venom beneath a genteel smile. And Miss Connolly, so meek, so overlooked, her silence had been a shield, one that had finally shattered under the weight of truth. Miss Harrington's voice, steady as ever, cut through the whispers. "Justice is never a single act," she said, her words measured. "It is a tide. It begins as a ripple, but it moves outward, touching those who never expected to be caught in its wake." She turned, stepping aside as the officers moved in. Wright sagged forward, the fight leaving him in a single, shuddering breath. Armitage held her composure, though her knuckles whitened as the cuffs closed around her wrists. Connolly only sobbed harder, whispering something inaudible, perhaps a plea, perhaps a confession meant for no one but herself. The judge's gavel struck wood. Court is adjourned. Arrests will be made immediately. Outside, the village exhaled. The streets of Blackmere, so quiet in the morning, now buzzed with the frantic energy of a scandal reaching its climax. Reporters, sharp-eyed and relentless, jotted down notes, their ink-dipped weapons poised to carve the story into tomorrow's headlines. The townsfolk, those who had whispered their own theories over fences and market stalls, now spilled into the streets, their eyes wide, their tongues eager. The manor, once a place of prestige, now stood against the dimming sky, its silhouette dark and jagged, a house that had held its secrets too tightly, only to have them ripped from its grasp. Miss Harrington walked past it all, her pace unhurried, her mind already sifting through the details of what had transpired. Greed, resentment, fear, threads woven so tightly into the fabric of human nature that they could never truly be unraveled. Evelyn's murder had been only the spark. The fire had consumed far more than a single life. It had reached into corners long thought safe, pulling truths into the light that had festered for years in the dark. She paused at the village sign, its paint faded but stubborn, like Blackmere itself, a place where history never quite settled, where the past lingered in the cracks of cobblestone streets and the whispers of old houses. Her gaze flicked back, past the courthouse, past the faces now etched with realization, toward the horizon where the manor stood in eerie silence. Secrets still lived there, she knew. For every truth dragged into the open, another waited in the wings. Reaching her home, she stepped inside, shrugging off her coat. The scent of tea leaves and old paper welcomed her, familiar and grounding. The kettle whistled from the stove, the fire crackled in its hearth, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe. Justice had been served, but justice was never as simple as a gavel's strike. It did not always feel like victory, not when ruin was so deeply personal, not when in the end, no one truly walked away unscathed. Outside, the rain began to fall, darkening the earth, washing the streets clean, for now, but Miss Harrington knew the truth of places like Blackmere. Here, history never slept, and secrets never stayed buried for long.